Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about protecting orangutans and Southeast Asian ecosystems, as well as getting sentient animals personhood status, with my guest, Dr. Gary Shapiro. He is the president and co-founder of the Orangutan Republic Foundation. He was formerly vice president and co-founder of the Orangutan Foundation International, and he worked as an environmental scientist with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. He has recently published his book, Out of the Cage, My Half-Century Journey from Curiosity to Concern for Indonesia's Person of the Forest. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you back on the program.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really happy to be able to talk about my book.
I am encouraging everybody to read this exciting, beautiful memoir of your experiences trying to help one of the great apes that's so related to us. In fact, don't we share most of our genetic gene pool?
Well, we do share 97% of our genetic material with orangutans. We're only slightly closer to gorillas at 98% and chimpanzees and bonobos at 99%. So we're all part of the community of equals when it comes to being an ape ourselves, because biologically speaking, we are all together within this clade of animals.
Back in 1998, I had the pleasure of visiting Malaysia with you and going to the Third Great Apes Conference in Borneo. We went out to see orangutans, and at that point, I found out that you were the first scientist, researcher to ever teach wild orangutans sign language. How did that come about?
Well, for mentioning that, I need to clarify it, because unlike maybe some of the stories you've heard, I actually did not work with wild orangutans. Although they are wild animals, these were actually ex-captive orangutans that we were returning to the wild. I would never go up to, say, a wild orangutan in the trees and try to interact that way. But as far as the project was concerned, in 1978, I was given the chance to be the first person really to go into any ape's natural environment and to teach them sign language. And I did that for my doctoral dissertation. It was part of that project. Spent 2 years getting to know dozens of orangutans that were free-ranging, and a number of them became my students. So it was an exciting time of my life, and I do talk about it extensively in the book.
In fact, when you were on the plane heading there for your first time, you told the pilot you were going to try and find out who did a murder.
Yeah, well, I thought it would be a great way to start the book, a murder mystery, right? And in fact, that was the impetus for my getting the call to go out there in the first place. In the book, I talk about receiving a phone call from my professor, Roger Fouts, and he had just talked to a woman named Birute Galdikas who had met him at a conference previously, and the idea was she was concerned and she wanted to find out if this one orangutan, her adopted son named Sagito, an ex-captive orangutan she was returning to the wild, she wanted to find out if we could use signs to get him to either talk about or confess to a murder, because another orangutan had died, drowned, and he was kind of like a potential suspect. So the thought was maybe we could teach him enough signs that he would admit to doing the dirty deed. But I saw it as a bigger opportunity to go out and do something extraordinary with my life at the time. As it turned out, I never had a chance to really get close to Sagito. He was always keeping his distance, and I had a chance to work with numerous other orangutans for those 2 years.
In fact, you got so close to one orangutan that when I first met you, you pulled out a picture of, quote, your daughter, Princess, and it's not a human being.
Right. Yeah. I had no qualms in telling people at the time, and actually later on, that Princess, who was a juvenile female orangutan, as my daughter. And I essentially adopted her, and she adopted me, and we lived together at the guest house in Camp Leakey. And for most of the time, she would sleep with me at night, And, I gave her own room. Every morning we would wake up and I would take her outside and we would sit down and do the breakfast sign language sessions with her, and I would take her around Camp Leakey, exploring the forest and down to the river. She would swim with me. I taught her how to stick her head underwater and hold her breath. She learned a lot more than what, say, a wild baby would learn or a juvenile would learn from her mother, but she had that chance, and along the way she was able to show her ability to learn and use signs in appropriate contexts.
You have so many great stories in your book, Out of the Cage, and also explanations about how we learn about our fellow creatures on the planet. Obviously, there's still research going on. What do you want to find out more about these animals that would help us save them?
Well, that's a good question. Some of not so much about just the behavior, although that's interesting too, because the latest study on self-medication of an orangutan putting a leaf on its face to help with a cut. But really, it's how do we ensure that we can take care of orangutans and better manage them in the wild as advocates for them through the research that we're doing, understanding the dynamics of their diet, their physiology, the disease aspects that they may have to deal with, all of that. All that's so important.
How many scientific research studies are there on the orangutan versus personal experiences, as I've just read in Out of the Cage?
Well, there's a lot of scientific research being done today on orangutans in various aspects, whether it's their physiology, their diet, behavior, their ecological aspects. There's very few about the kind of memoir that I have had.
You describe many of the different orangutans that you worked with. You taught sign language to, but tell us what an orangutan looks like, because apparently their faces are each individual, just like human beings, and that's how you could tell which animal was who.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, each orangutan is different, just like you and me. If we spend enough time with most animals, we'll be able to distinguish individuals by certain characteristics. So the faces clearly are quite different. And I can look at, say, for an example, an orangutan and see the placement of the eyes and see that the configuration of the nose and the mouth. I say that this is probably an offspring of this particular orangutan. And they have a certain look about them that they pass down to their offspring. As the offspring gets older, you start to see those characteristics clearly. The face is quite different, the body, the stance, how they move. And so from a distance, you see a silhouette and you can say, oh, that's Saswoyo coming towards me, or that's Onyuk walking away from me. Or again, every orangutan was given a name. After a while, you stop thinking about them as being orangutans, but just being different individuals that you know.
And they are very strong. When I was with you, I saw one just rip off the pocket of your shirt.
Yeah, well, easy to do if you're an orangutan. You're looking in your pocket for some goodies and you don't find it, and so you just pull your hand away and there goes the pocket. They're 5 to 8 times stronger pound per pound than we are. If you watch an orangutan climb a tree effortlessly, it's amazing. You know that their strength in their hands are really, really strong. They have very little fat on their body. It's very dense muscle tissue, muscle fibers, and so this is why they don't swim. If they go into the water, they sink like rocks. And again, they avoid going into water, although unlike maybe gorillas and chimps that are more afraid, orangutans have been known to wade carefully across the water. So they're not deathly afraid, but they are very cautious near water.
You did mention that you ran Camp Leakey for 2 years, and that was a place named after the very famous anthropologist from Kenya. Could you explain the connection between Leakey and Berute and even Jane Goodall with the chimpanzees and Dian Fossey with the gorillas in Africa?
Sure, just briefly, just to let you know, I was actually co-managing it only when Berute and Rod Brindamore were away. I was then given assignment to run the camp, so I was kind of vice director, not directing it. As far as Camp Leakey, it was kind of an homage to Louis Leakey, the celebrated paleoanthropologist you mentioned that gave Jane Goodall, Dian Fossey, and Berute Galdikas their start. He felt that these 3 women, or women in general, would be perhaps more adept at observing and kind of ferreting out some of the behavioral similarities that they have with humans and to be able to have a perspective that before that was pretty much a male-dominated, I think, study of animals in the field. So he was really keen on getting ladies out there into the forest, observing them, and so through his efforts, he was able to support them in a variety of ways and make sure that the primates, as we call them, had a chance to study the three major great apes.
You worked for many, many years with Berute at Camp Leakey with her organization, but your book also describes some of the reasons you broke away from her group and formed your own organization, and you named yours not orangutan as one word in English, but like the Indonesian, Orangutan Republic with a K. And you did that with your wife of 37 years, who is Indonesian, and you have described a little bit about why the break occurred between you and your wife and Berute. Could you explain more of the focus that she was involved with an orangutan orphanage, so to speak, had over 200 captive orangutans that she was trying to care for and hopefully release back into the wild if they were able to do so, but you started believing that the local people and the people of the country needed to have more conservation education in order to protect the ecosystems and protect this animal?
Yeah, I can comment briefly on it, not to take away the actual what's in the book. I worked for 18 years as a vice president for the Orangutan Foundation International and had quite a bit of responsibility, as you know, putting on those conferences that you attended and a whole host of things, just managing a lot of the day in and day out aspects of it. But the Orangutan Foundation International, and like a number of other organizations, are so involved with the maintaining of orangutans ex-captives and bringing them back to health and supporting them as they transition back to the wild, that not enough was being done on the education side, which is to kind of address the cause of why this is happening. Instead of just treating the symptoms, we wanted to actually work to treat the cause and to change how people's attitudes were about orangutans, because at the end of the day, you know, we just can't afford to be losing them out of the forest because of their slow reproductive breeding cycles. It's just taking one or a couple out of a metapopulation could drive it to extinction. So we needed to be able to focus on changing that dynamic, and my wife and I felt that I'd spent enough time at OFI and it was time to really focus on education, and we decided to move away from, say, Borneo for a while, and we focused on Sumatra, where at the time orangutans were critically endangered. The status in 2004, when we started the Orangutan Republic, only the Sumatran orangutan was critically endangered. Since then, now all orangutans are critically endangered, but we thought that we would focus our efforts in North Sumatra, partnering with different organizations, developing education programs, and we started the scholarship programs. Our focus was really to address the conservation through conservation education. So that's kind of how that went.
You are still doing so. Every year you have the Pongo Awards for people doing great conservation work. Why that name?
Well, that's another interesting story, because the Pongo Awards, which we don't talk about in the book, was something we came up with when we did a conference in Sumatra, 2007. At that time, it was just called the Pongo Awards, and we gave it out to some of the officials and some of the business folks who were helping us and our nonprofit group there to kind of honor them with this award. And then in 2014, we decided to expand the concept of the Pongo Awards from not just honoring people who work with orangutans, but environmental issues and achievements across the globe in different categories. So we kind of expanded the scope of the award. But we need to go back to the scholarships, which I think are so important, because that has been one of our signature programs, Nancy. We have been giving out scholarships since 2006 to Indonesian students who are going into the natural sciences. I'm talking about like forestry, biology, and veterinary science. And from a single one we gave out in 2006, we have now given out 274, and not just in Sumatra. We moved back to Kalimantan, and we're giving them to university students or university-bound students going into these natural sciences fields in a variety of universities in all of the orangutan range provinces of Indonesia. At this moment, we were proud to say over 190 of them have graduated, with more than 15% going into conservation organizations or endeavors. So what this is doing, it's really helping to address the concern that we had early on. How do we change the Indonesian society to look at orangutans in a different way, to value them, to respect them and their autonomy in the forest? And we do that by getting the students to matriculate and work with the non-government organizations that are taking care of orangutans in those provinces. So I'll be going back to Indonesia every year to give out more scholarships. And this has become, I think, one of the highlights of this organization.
But if people want to support you here in Southern California, you have a beautiful gala gathering every year in Los Angeles. And I encourage people to go and enjoy Indonesian food, see some beautiful videos, meet some superb conservationists, and participate in supporting this effort. And we are going to talk more about the efforts of Gary Shapiro trying to save all the orangutans on the planet when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Dr. Gary Shapiro. He is president and co-founder of the Orangutan Republic Foundation. In your book, Out of the Cage, My Half-Century Journey from Curiosity to Concern for Indonesia's Person of the Forest, you detailed some incredible experiences you had in the wild, learning about orangutans. Mm-hmm. At some point, it became obvious to you and to the reader, me, that these beings are not just animals, but they're sentient and actually should deserve personhood status legally. Mm-hmm. You call it the theory of mind?
Well, the theory of mind is only one of the bits of evidence that we use to help make the case scientifically that orangutans are deserving of this type of legal personhood status. I mean, the fact that they're conscious of their being, and not only that, they're aware of what others are thinking. This is what we imply by theory of mind, that they can infer what others are thinking about. And I saw this early on, how they would be looking at you and they would be watching how you're moving around camp, and you could see the kind of cogs turning in their head. It was really amazing. And again, interacting with them on numerous occasions, I saw how they would be using this ability to infer other people's intentions and what they were planning on doing to actually strategize for their own benefit. I'll give you just an example. When I was working with Rini, the orangutan, she was my first student. In fact, Rini was the first adult great ape to be given intensive sign language training. Great apes are very strong, very, very unpredictable sometimes, especially chimpanzees. But with orangutans, probably you can kind of understand them a little bit easier if you spend time with them. And I was so fortunate first day at Camp Leakey to meet Rini, who was an adult free-ranging orangutan on the other side of Camp Leakey. And I started immediately, maybe it was kind of foolish on my part, but I had no fear at that time. I went across and I started molding her hands into the different signs. And eventually we would do this on a daily basis. I would teach her some of the signs that I wanted her to learn. And there was one point when I was trying to leave the area, and this youngster was trying to come with me on the other side of the river, and I was trying to push him away, even using the oar with the canoe, pushing him out of the boat. And Rini just came up to that orangutan and just gave it a little bite, and it gave a little cry, and it took off. She knew I didn't want this orangutan to come into the boat. She inferred that, and so she came out and she helped me out. That's just one example, but there are plenty of examples of orangutans doing this kind of a thing, looking at, watching other people and inferring their mentality. And so that's what we mean by theory of mind.
You mentioned some animals, some places, some countries have given personhood status to other animals than human beings?
I can tell you one of the most, I think, celebrated examples of an non-human person would be Sandra, the orangutan, who in Argentina back in 2014, about 10 years ago, was the subject of a case that was being brought forth to the courts of Argentina by a nonprofit animal rights lawyer group. According to what we read in the press, this orangutan named Sandra was given a non-human personhood status, and thereby we were allowed, and there were myself and two other experts, to testify in court on her behalf. What the law group wanted to do is get her out of the zoo because they saw that she was pining away as a solitary individual, not looking happy, according to them, and they wanted to get her into a sanctuary. So I was able to speak on behalf of Sandra in a sense. I was able to tell the court about how wild orangutans behave and how ex-captives, and my testimony, I think, helped perhaps provide that kind of context to the court. It took a while for this to happen, but eventually Sandra was transferred from Argentina to the United States, and she now lives in a sanctuary in Florida at the Center for Great Apes. She lost her personhood status because in America we still have not yet evolved to the point of accepting this as something we should afford most of the large sentient beings like elephants and chimpanzees and cetaceans as well as orangutans. So we're still in the process of trying to change the laws here in the United States. But some countries have given rights to wild animals. I think Ecuador has done that for wild animals. There are some countries who've given legal rights, personhood status to rivers and other natural phenomena because they revere them. And so it's not that unreasonable to extend it to the great apes on the basis of the scientific knowledge that we have about them. And I think the zeitgeist hopefully will be changing in the near future.
Hopefully what will change is the perception among people that they take in wild animals and keep them in captivity. Orangutans and other creatures have been very mistreated as, quote, pets. And when they get older, they get strong. People don't want them anymore. They are raised in cages and chains and horrible conditions. And this whole situation obviously needs to evolve into giving the animals the space, but they need the ecosystems. And orangutans are also threatened due to rainforest destruction for palm oil plantations. You mentioned briefly in your book about what is going on with the ecosystems and what people can do. Can you summarize that for us?
Well, I can tell you that currently all the 3 orangutan species are considered critically endangered. This means that if we don't continue to address the issues, there's a high likelihood that many of the, I would say, the meta populations, those are the small populations because of the fragmentation of the forest, they have a high likelihood of going extinct. And so one of the benefits of having groups like ours and others, our partners in the field, is that we continue to put attention on the situation. And it's really a dynamic, Nancy, where you've got a country like Indonesia with 277 million people and a government trying to feed and maintain this large population, the 4th largest country in the world, the natural resources that they have. And those of us in the West who have already seen how our natural environment has been degraded, we just cannot look down our noses at them and tell them what to do. They have to discover it on their own. And that's why education is so important, is that we need to get the people of Indonesia to speak amongst themselves about what they can do to transition to a more sustainable future. And I'm really happy that the government and many of the organizations there are kind of on board with this. But frankly, large industry, globalization of how we do things in this world has really put a dent onto slowing down some of the deforestation because mining, not just the plantations. And I should tell you that since 2018, there's been a moratorium on opening new palm oil plantations. And the idea is to keep working on the ones we have right now, but unfortunately, in those areas which have been historically given a concession license, there are still occasionally violations of opening up areas that should be maintained as primary or secondary forest because they're still within those concessions, and the concession holders have an obligation to operate within the laws of Indonesia. And we know that in remote areas where it's hard to enforce the law, sometimes there'll be violations, and we're very lucky to have satellites in the sky that we can actually monitor and call this out. So there are numerous organizations that are doing this, and this whole dynamic, Nancy, of industry, government, the local people, and of course the orangutans being able to work together to try to find a solution, a long-term solution for the orangutans is kind of the whole idea of my vision of the orangutan republic is a time where orangutans and humans, and of course the biodiversity, we can all live sustainably together and not worry about the long-term negative impacts that are right in front of us right now. If we can figure out good ways to work together, we will have, I think, a very vibrant and a positive future. But if we take our eye off the ball and we allow this to continue, it could be very bad for a number of these metapopulations that there's only several hundred animals, and it just takes the killing of a mother here or there to cause that population to drop to extinction. So, yes, I may have talked a lot about this. It's a dynamic, very complicated issue. And when people talk about palm oil and they say, well, we just have to boycott it, that's not the answer. We have to really encourage the transition to sustainable palm oil. That means not opening up new forests, and that means managing those areas for the benefit of the people, but not destroy the integrity of the remaining part of the rainforest. And that's the whole, I think, important part of it.
And for those of us here in the United States, we can follow your suggestions, just 2 short pages of shop smartly, what we buy, and also volunteer, because basically you're a volunteer organization and you need people to get involved.
Exactly.
And how do they do that? What's your website?
The website is orangutanrepublic.org. That's ORANGUTANREPUBLIK.
You obviously kept detailed diaries, journals, that you have drafted your story of 50 years of research and conservation. How many pages did you have to go through to write Out of the Cage?
Well, I'll be honest with you. The first 2 years were the ones that I documented daily in a diary. The rest of it has been just pulled from notes that I've been able to find and locate.
I loved your pictures. How many do you have, and how did you decide which ones to use?
Well, I have lots of photos over the years, but both in old formats and new formats. It was really challenging to figure out which ones to use. Frankly, it was just hunting down and just choosing the ones that I liked.
In writing this kind of memoir, you can't include all the stories that you would like to. What is one that you will be putting in your next edition?
Oh, it was a real problem. My editor cut out so many of my stories. One of the interesting ones that I had was doing an expedition across part of Tanjung Puting to discover Bird Lake with Berete and some others. We actually hired poachers to help us go through the heart of the reserve, and that was cut out of the book.
You have so many stories of your experiences with the orangutans. I wish we had more time to hear them all. I can only encourage everybody to read this very charming, easy-to-read book, and you have lots and lots of pictures from you when you were a young researcher to the conferences. I want everybody to get a copy of Out of the Cage, My Half-Century Journey from Curiosity to Concern for Indonesia's Person of the Forest. At the very end of your book, you mentioned Out of the Cage. What does it mean?
It's really a title that encompasses a number of things, but clearly my time in the forest with orangutans that were out of the cage. It's really what I'd like to see all orangutans be, out of their imprisonments in institutions, respect for them to be free and wild in the forest, And we ourselves have to get out of our own cage, the way we think about things. The idea is that out of the cage is a visionary statement, just like the Orangutan Republic. It's a hope that we can get people to see that orangutans and other sentient beings should be free and out of the cage. I hope that people will learn more about orangutans and the rainforest and what they can do to help save it.
Thank you so very much for giving us your experiences so that we can appreciate and enjoy and preserve these wonderful creatures. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for having me.
I have been speaking with Dr. Gary Shapiro, President and co-founder of the Orangutan Republic Foundation. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.